The day my mother stopped speaking to me, she was standing beside the clothesline behind our farmhouse. I remember the wind lifting the edge of her apron. I remember the white sheets swaying between us like ghosts. And I remember thinking that if I just explained myself one more time, if I just found the right words, everything would somehow go back to normal. But she never looked at me, not once. My mother, the woman who had held my hand through childhood fevers, braided my hair before church, and sat beside me during thunderstorms when I was afraid of the lightning, stood less than 10 feet away and acted as though I no longer existed. The silence hurt more than any words ever could. At the time, I thought that moment was the worst thing that would happen after I left the Amish. I was wrong, because what happened 6 months later changed everything I thought I knew about family, faith, and the price of freedom. But I'll come back to that. My name is Emma. I was 26 years old when my mother stopped speaking to me. I grew up in an old-order Amish community in rural Pennsylvania, surrounded by rolling fields, horse-drawn buggies, church gatherings in family homes, and rules that I never questioned for most of my life. At least not out loud. Today, years later, I want to tell you what leaving actually cost me. Not the things people usually talk about. Not electricity, not cars, not smartphones. I want to talk about the things that can't be replaced. The things nobody warns you about. If stories like mine matter to you, I hope you'll subscribe and stay for the conversation. There are truths about Amish life that rarely get spoken aloud, and sometimes the quietest stories carry the heaviest weight. When people imagine Amish childhoods, they often picture simplicity. In some ways, they're right. I remember summer evenings when the fields glowed gold beneath the setting sun. I remember helping my sisters snap green beans on the porch, while my mother prepared supper. I remember the smell of fresh bread filling the kitchen. The kitchen was the heart of everything. The old wooden table had scratches from generations of family meals. The stove warmed the room even during cold winters. There was always work to do, always someone arriving, always something baking. As a child, I loved it. I loved the certainty, the rhythm, the feeling that everyone knew exactly who they were and where they belonged. I didn't understand then how powerful that feeling could be, or how dangerous. One of the most important lessons I learned growing up wasn't written anywhere. No one sat me down and explained it directly. You absorbed it simply by living. The lesson was this: belonging came from obedience. The people who followed the rules belonged. The people who questioned them didn't. At 8 years old, that lesson seemed harmless. At 18, it felt comforting. At 26, it shattered my life. I remember church Sundays most clearly. Every other week, church would be held at a different family's home. Before sunrise, women hurried through kitchens preparing food. Men arranged benches. Children were scrubbed clean and dressed carefully. Buggies lined the lane for what seemed like miles. The entire community gathered together. We worshipped, we ate, we visited. We reinforced the invisible bonds that connected everyone. And those bonds were strong. Stronger than outsiders can imagine. When your entire world exists inside one community, approval becomes oxygen. You don't notice you're breathing it until it's taken away. I was 17 when I first felt something shift inside me. Not rebellion, not anger, just questions. Small questions, the kind that seem harmless. Why did certain rules exist? Why could some church leaders bend expectations while others couldn't? Why were some struggles discussed openly while others remained hidden? I never asked these questions publicly. I wasn't trying to challenge anyone. I genuinely wanted to understand. But curiosity can be dangerous in places where certainty is valued above all else. At first, nobody noticed. Or if they did, they ignored it. Life continued. I worked alongside my family. I attended church. I followed expectations. I courted a young Amish man named Samuel for a time. Everyone assumed my future was already written. Marriage, children, church. The same path my mother had followed. The same path her mother had followed. The same path stretching back through generations. And for a while, I believed that future would be mine too. Then something happened. A small moment. One conversation. A tiny crack in the foundation. I was helping clean after a church gathering when I overheard two older women speaking quietly near the pantry. They didn't know I was there. One woman mentioned a family whose daughter had left years earlier. The other woman shook her head. Her mother still cries about it. I remember freezing. Not because someone had left, people left sometimes, but because of what she said next. It's like burying a child who is still alive. Those words stayed with me, for years. At the time, I didn't understand why. Now I do. Because she wasn't describing death. She was describing separation. The kind of separation created intentionally, the kind designed to hurt, the kind designed to bring people back. I didn't realize then that one day those same words would describe my own family. By 22, my questions had grown. The world beyond our community felt less frightening than it once had. I met people through work. I heard stories. I encountered perspectives I had never been allowed to consider. None of it happened dramatically. There was no lightning bolt, no single event. Just a slow awakening, like standing in a dark room while someone gradually opens the curtains. The more light entered, the harder it became to pretend the room hadn't changed. The first warning came from my father. We were repairing fence posts near the pasture. The air smelled of fresh-cut hay. Neither of us spoke much. Then suddenly he said, "People who spend too much time looking outside usually stop appreciating what's inside." I knew exactly what he meant. He knew I knew. Neither of us said anything more. That was how warnings worked in our community. Quiet, indirect, heavy. Months later, church leaders spoke with me. The conversation seemed friendly on the surface, concerned, gentle. But beneath every sentence was the same message. Come back into line. Stop questioning. Trust authority. Trust tradition. Trust the system. At first I tried. I really did. I prayed harder, worked harder, pushed my doubts aside. But doubts don't disappear simply because they're inconvenient. Eventually they grow, and mine did. The pressure increased slowly. Friends became cautious around me. Certain conversations stopped when I entered rooms. People who once sought my company suddenly seemed busy. I felt something changing, something invisible. I didn't understand then that my social world was already beginning to shrink. The loneliness arrived before the actual separation. That's something people rarely discuss. The distancing starts long before anyone officially leaves. I remember one winter evening sitting alone beside the window. Snow covered the fields. The world outside looked peaceful. Inside, I felt torn apart. I loved my family. I loved parts of my community. I loved many of the people around me. Yet I could no longer ignore the truth growing inside me. The life everyone expected me to live wasn't the life I believed I could continue living honestly. That realization terrified me, because once you see something clearly, pretending becomes exhausting, and eventually impossible. Still, I stayed. For months, then years, trying to convince myself I could make it work. Trying to convince myself that sacrificing my own voice was a reasonable price to pay for belonging. But deep down, I knew something was coming. A decision, a collision. A moment when I would have to choose between acceptance and authenticity. What I didn't know was how much that choice would cost, or that the person who would suffer most wasn't me, it was my mother. At least that's what I believed then. Years later, after I left, after the silence began, after the heartbreak nearly broke me completely, an older woman named Ruth would tell me something that changed my understanding forever. Ruth had left the Amish decades earlier. She carried herself with a calmness I envied. One afternoon, as tears ran down my face while I described my mother's silence, Ruth listened quietly. Then she said words I will never forget. Emma, your mother isn't choosing between loving you and not loving you. I looked at her, confused. Ruth reached across the table. She's choosing between her love for you and her fear of losing everything she's ever known. For the first time, I saw the situation differently. Not as villains and victims, not as good people and bad people, but as ordinary people trapped inside expectations larger than themselves. That realization didn't erase the pain, but it changed the direction of my healing. Because I finally understood something I had missed for years. The system was never held together by cruelty alone. It was held together by fear. Fear of losing family. Fear of losing belonging. Fear of becoming the next warning story. And once I understood that, I began to see my mother's silence in a completely different way. But before I could reach that understanding, there was still one final heartbreak waiting for me, the one I hinted at in the beginning. The event that happened 6 months after my mother stopped speaking to me. The event that forced me to confront what leaving Amish life actually costs. And when it happened, I realized that freedom and grief sometimes arrive holding hands.